Hey, how's it going, guys? This is going to be the third part in the series where I go through and give my thoughts on all the cards in One Step from Eden. What do I think of them? When do I think you should take them? What synergies they have? And just how good are they in general? So, today we're going to be going through the Doublelift cards. So, let's begin. Our first card here is going to be Ambient Burst. It's going to do 5. It's going to shoot for 5 damage for each spell you've cast this battle, and it anchors. Now, this card's almost decent, but the anchor really kills it. If you can't get rid of the anchor, this just falls apart real quick, because it's the kind of spell that you want to cast really late into a fight after you've cast a bunch of other stuff. So you're mostly just going to be using this on bosses. But the more use you're getting out of this spell, the longer it's anchoring you, which is really unfortunate. It's a scaling spell, but there are other scaling spells that just outdo it very easily, like Jam Slam, Eternity Cannon, etc., etc. So it just kind of gets left in the dust by spells like that. Ultimately, this isn't a spell I recommend taking very often because it just takes too long to get off the ground. The anchor is just miserable, and there are just a lot of spells that do its job better than it. Next, we got Deck Slam. So, it's going to do 10 damage for each spell in your deck in one hit. For 2 mana, this starts to become a decent rate around the time you have 15 cards in your deck. At 20 cards, this becomes a good rate. At 30 cards, this is a very solid rate. And beyond that, it just gets even better. Now, obviously, whether you want this or not depends on the size of your deck. So, that's really up to you. If your deck is under 15 cards, stay far away from this. If it's 20 or over, it starts to become worth it. 30 or more, definitely look to take this. Echo. Okay, this one is probably one of the stronger cards in the game, just because of what it represents. If you use it correctly, Echo will always just be another copy of whatever the strongest card in your deck is, and it'll always cost 2 mana no matter what. So, for instance, you could, like, double up on your Fimbulvator with Echo, and then it's essentially 2 mana Fimbulvator. But something to keep in mind with Echo is that if the card you're copying with it consumes, Echo will also consume. So keep that in mind. Generally, you should be taking Echo quite highly, because it'll always, for the most part, it'll pretty much always be the strongest card in your deck. Usually, unless the really powerhouse cards in your deck are things like Double Switch. But yeah, for the most part, this is just going to be a really powerful card at a very discounted rate. I would very highly consider taking this pretty much all the time I see it. It's really hard to come up with stuff that's going to outperform this, especially if you already have some very high power level cards in your deck. So next we have Fling. It's going to cast a spell in the air slot and consume that spell. This is a weird one. It's the kind of spell that you would probably want to use to fling out things like Midnight or Fimbulvator or Sunshine or other really expensive spells that are consuming anyway. That's the primary use case here. Besides that, if you're using it to fling things like Thunder Strikes or Whirls, just get them out of the deck. I don't know if it's really worth it, because you have to hold on to it until you get the spell you're wanting to fling in the other slot, or vice versa. Ultimately, it's kind of a difficult spell to use. I rarely take it, but I can tell you it is possible to make this effect worthwhile, because the ability to cast something really expensive for just 1 mana can be a huge deal sometimes. So I would imagine most people are staying away from Fling for the most part, but I definitely recommend experimenting with it more, because you can do some pretty good stuff with it. And I think people are kind of sleeping on this card a bit. Next up, we have Gambit. So you're going to shuffle your deck instantly and throw out a random shot for every card in your deck. Now, this means your base deck. So if your deck has 24 cards in it at base, it's going to throw out 24 shots. It doesn't mean your current deck. That means it doesn't count things like kunais or jams or anything like that. So for 4 mana, how good is this effect? Well, there's a few things we need to consider here. Firstly, how big is your deck? Obviously, the bigger your deck is, the more useful Gambit's going to be. The other thing we need to consider is it going to be worthwhile to spend 4 mana to instantly shuffle? If you have things like speed loaders or dual disc or anything like that, this becomes significantly worse. So it's kind of mutually exclusive with those types of artifacts. Having speed loader or dual disc or flash reloader or anything like that as an artifact pretty much means that this is never worth taking. And vice versa. If you already have Gambit in the deck and you're given a choice of a speed loader and like 2 other artifacts, you probably don't want to take the speed loader because you already have Gambit for this job. Now, how good this is kind of depends on your mana regen, honestly. If you have a very high mana regen and you tend to have excess mana sometimes, Gambit can be very powerful because it lets you convert that excess mana into shuffle speed, which can be very valuable. Now, 4 mana is a little bit pricey, but in the right kind of deck, this can save you a lot of time on shuffle, and if the mana regen's high enough, the mana cost presumably won't be as big of a deal as the time it would have taken to shuffle the deck normally. So this is the kind of card that really depends on what your artifacts look like, what your stats look like, what your deck looks like, and so on. Next up we have Jam Cannon. This one's really interesting. So using this normally can be a bit of a pain because presumably you're probably going to be casting the jams before you shuffle your deck, so this isn't scaling at all. The way I usually like to use this is I'll see a jam cannon, I already have some jam stuff going on, I'll have like a mana jam already, I'll pick up the jam cannon, and then for this specifically, I really want to be looking for the upgrade on this that does double damage and consumes, because that way you're getting all the damage out of it, and then even more than that. And then after the first cycle through the deck, you spend all your jams, and you don't have to worry about the jam can anymore because it's out of the deck. Obviously, if you don't already have cards like Jam Slam or Railgun or Skewer or any of that kind of stuff, stay away from this. However, if you don't have any of those cards and you do have Mana Jam, and say you see a Jam Cannon and it's pre-upgraded with double damage and consume, or gain 5 max life and consume, or anything that consumes it really, then it's definitely worth picking up. It's one of those cards that, personally, I prefer it to consume, because it comes just too difficult to get use out of the second time through the deck. Next up, we have Jam Slam. This one, unlike Jam Cannon, is more of a scaling card and less of a front-loaded card. It's going to do 60 damage for each jam you've cast this battle. So the first time through the deck, it is going to be absolutely worthless. The second time through the deck, it's going to depend on how much jam stuff you have going on. Keep in mind that for multi-hit cards, there's an upgrade that causes them to add a jam to the deck and gives them +4 shots. So if this is the kind of strategy you're going for, it might be worthwhile to look for those kinds of cards and see if you can get that upgrade on them. As for Jam Slam itself, it's a scaling card, of course, and it's going to scale a lot faster than something like Ambient Burst, because we're getting 60 damage out of it per jam. So we have Railgun and Skewer. The Jam Slam is going to be adding 240 damage every time you go through a deck, which is a pretty quick rate of scaling. As for taking this, I discourage taking it speculatively. However, I would take it after I already have a Railgun in the deck. Honestly, Railgun, we'll talk more about that when we get there, but this is kind of, in my opinion, the gateway card to the jam strategy here. So take this if you already have the supporting stuff for it. Otherwise, avoid it unless you're really trying to force a jam build. Now we have Midnight, which is a calamity. It's gonna essentially fling every card in your deck. This does not include cards you've already cast out of the deck, only what's left in the deck. So, at 6 mana, this is going to be really expensive. You're going to need to stack some max mana up before you can even consider using this. And honestly, it's more of a late game card. There are essentially 2 ways you want to be using this. The first way is to consume everything but a small subset of cards from the deck. And the second way is going to be to try to consume the entire deck, only leaving something like a Voodoo spell or an Eternity Cannon in the deck. So that way you can use those against boss fights, and presumably the Midnight is going to be able to clear most room battles by itself. Which brings me to my next point about Midnight. Assuming your deck is decently sized, Midnight is generally powerful enough that it can clear most non-boss encounters all by itself without any further input from you. So it's really useful for that. But if you're going to do that, then I really recommend getting something that's going to help you against boss fights after you cast Midnight in the deck, like the aforementioned Voodoo spell or Eternity Cannon. Or, of course, you can just use a small subset of cards that you're casting before the midnight and just using those in boss fights. Ultimately, I would not take midnight until you've already set up a situation where it's going to be decently useful. I think it's okay to take it before you have a way to make it really good in boss fights, just because of how easily it clears room battles. However, if it's relatively early in the game, I would stay away from it. This is more of a late game build around card, because once you pick midnight, it kind of starts warping your entire strategy around itself. And it's a very interesting card to use because of that. I think people aren't giving it enough credit. I think people should pick it more often because, kind of like Fling, I think they're sleeping on this card. It's a lot more powerful than it seems at first glance, I promise you. Next we have Preload. 2 mana for 20 damage is a terrible rate, but this reduces your shuffle time by 1 second. Something that's not mentioned on the card is that this fires a projectile which pierces. So, this is kind of like Gambit's little brother. It's going to, much like Gambit, it's going to allow you to turn your mana into shuffle time. Unlike Gambit, it does work very well with Speed Loader because it doesn't instantly shuffle your deck, it just reduces the shuffle time. You kind of want to take this in the same place you want to take Gambit, but clearly you never want to put this in the same deck as Gambit because they just don't work together. So really, whichever one you see first, if your deck is really interested in reducing your shuffle time, that's the one you're going to use. But never take both of them because they'll just get in each other's ways. Generally, I think it's okay to take preload pretty early in a run, just because of how useful it can be later on, especially if you end up with a smaller, more refined deck that's looking to use a combo that consists of just a few cards. Throwing something like Preload or Gambit in there will really increase the efficiency of your combo if you have enough mana regen to support it. Especially if your combo doesn't require any mana. Like, let's say you're running a Virya spell deck and you've removed everything for the most part except for the Virya spell, and then you're offered Gambit or Preload. You take the Gambit or Preload, and since Virya spell doesn't cost any mana anyway, then the mana requirement from these spells is kind of negligible because you're not spending your mana on anything else regardless. Alright, so next we got Railgun. This is going to do 50 times 3 damage for 0 mana, but it adds 2 jams. So, the clear upside here is that we're using this to clear room fights, and the thought is that hopefully the room will be cleared before we get to the jams, so the jams won't matter, in which case we just did 50 times 3 damage for no mana. Then this is a great card. On boss fights, if you don't have any jam synergies, this really isn't that great anymore because the jams are going to cost 4 mana total to get out of the way, and 4 mana for 150 damage is an abysmal rate. Now, if you do have Jam Synergies, clearly you're taking this card because it's 0 mana for 5 times 50 times 3 damage, and you're getting more use out of the jams after you've cast them. Skewer is kind of in a similar boat. Oh, by the way, if you're in a jam deck, take this. If you need help on room fights, take this. If you're not in a jam deck, this is another card that I would recommend looking for 2 times damage and consume on, because that's really good on it if you're not here for the jam synergy. Even if you can't find that, using this for room fights is going to be really good, especially if you can clear rooms before getting all the way through your deck, just because it's obviously unbelievably mana efficient. And as I was kind of implying with Jam Slam, this is what I consider the primary gateway card to a jam deck. Like, when I go for jam strategies, I'll never see the Jam Slam first and take that and just hope it works out. What pretty much always ends up happening is I'll get the Railgun first. I'll take it because it's a good card either way. And then when I see the Jam Slam and the Skewer later, I'll take those as well because I already have the Railgun, so now I can just put the pieces together and it all works out fine. So anyway, Skewer is Railgun's little brother. It is 0 mana for 60 damage and adds 1 jam to your deck. This is significantly worse than Railgun, because it's significantly worse than Railgun in pretty much every situation, to be honest, because in a non-jam synergy deck, if you're just trying to use this to clear out room fights, this is going to only do 60 damage, and then the 60 damage isn't nearly as much as the Railgun, but it's the same rate. They both cost 0 mana, and because you're only doing 60 damage with this, there's a significantly higher risk that you're going to reach the end of your deck before the room's clear, in which case you're going to be stuck with this jam. The other thing is, not only is this doing significantly less damage, but since it's only adding the 1 jam to your deck, it's also a bit worse with jam synergies, because with jam synergies, you kind of want bigger effects and more jams, because the idea is you're getting these powerful undercost effects, but the punishment's supposed to be that you're putting jams in your deck, but since you're running jam synergies, you're turning these jams into something useful. Now, obviously, in a jam synergy deck, this card's spectacular. I'll always look for this in a jam deck. But if you're not running a jam deck, this is not what you want to be doing. Railgun's great there, even without the jam synergies, but Skewer, not so much. It's just not quite enough damage to be totally worth it. Next up, we have Sustain. So for 1 mana, if our Trinity is full, we gain shield equal to the damage of the spell in the other slot. Hold up. Let me double check something. Yeah, okay. So, this is a really weird card. It's kind of like Switch Bait, but for shield, but it requires you to have Trinity. So, not only do you need to be able to get the Trinity on this reliably, because if you just have Sustain, then it's going to take way too long to get Trinity cast on it. And on top of that, you need a card with high enough damage to make this worth it. Spending 3 Trinity and This, I think, only really becomes worth it if you're getting at least 150 shield out of this. Any lower than that, and it's just too much hassle to make it worth it. Now, in a dedicated Trinity deck, which is presumably the, well, not dedicated, in a deck with the Trinity package, this is presumably, which is presumably the only place you're going to be able to make this work reliably. I would think that you would rather be spending your Trinity on your better, more offensive options instead of using it just to shield up, but then you've lost all your Trinity, so now you have to build Trinity back up so you can cast your Trirag or whatever. I just don't know about this card. It feels like the ceiling's definitely really high. If you can use this with something like a souped up Sarah cannon or something similar to that, I can see how this would be strong, but needing both the super high damage spell as well as the Trinity cast for this to do anything is a bit of a tall order. If I'm being totally honest, I haven't experimented with this card that much. I've tried using it. Every time it just ends up being a huge hassle to get it to work, and it never feels like it's worth it. It always feels like I'm jumping through all these hoops just to get this thing to work, and then what? I got some shield, but the enemies are all still alive. I still need to figure out what I'm doing for damage after I've assembled this silly combo. But hey, maybe you'll have more success with sustain than I have. Uh-oh, next up we got Switchbait. This card right here is ridiculous. For 2 mana, you're shooting 2 shots, and they do damage equal to the damage of the spell in the other slot. Now, I've already mentioned in the previous videos a few spells that this card is ridiculous with, but there's even more later on. Some of which are even more ridiculous, if I'm being honest, but I think there's enough cards that are insane with Switchbait in the game that you can take Switchbait whenever and be fairly confident that you'll find something to break it. Whenever I see Switchbait, odds are I'm taking it just because of the sheer raw power it offers. For 2 mana, Switchbait can do, just by itself, it doesn't even need any upgrades, but with upgrades it becomes even more absurd. With just something like a Ragnarok even, that's 2 mana for 700 damage. That's nuts. That's just ridiculous damage. So, definitely take Switchbait. The card is really, really, really strong. And honestly, I would not be surprised if this thing gets nerfed in the future. Because it's just so much better than so many cards. Time slows time for 3 seconds now. What people like to do with this is they like to take it on Gunner and use it to essentially cheese the game. I don't really like doing that. I don't think it's a very fun strategy. It's just kind of cheesy, really. But if that's what you want to do, you can go for it. Outside of that, this card is it's not that great outside of that, because this is the kind of effect that you're going to want at a specific time in a fight. You're going to want it at a specific time, but then the problem becomes, what if that specific time comes and I don't have the time slow ready? And what if it's going to be a little while before I need the time slow, but I have it in my spell slot already? Then what do I do? Do I hold on to it, just let it gunk up the spell slots? Honestly, I don't think it's worth it, just because of how cumbersome it can be. You need a specific situation for it to be good, and if you don't get in that specific situation, it's kind of useless. And if that specific situation comes and you didn't have it, then it was still useless because it didn't do the thing that you needed it to do. So honestly, I would kind of stay away from it. It's the same thing with time stop. People like using this on Gunner, but to a lesser extent, just to cheese the game. It's the same thing, really, except I kinda think that stopping time isn't quite as good as slowing time for various reasons. It's really hard to explain if you haven't experienced these effects both quite often before. That and it costs more mana. Honestly, I think Time Slow is the better card. But outside of Gunner Cheese, I don't think you should be taking either of these cards because they're just too finicky, they're too specific, and they're too hard to make worthwhile. Now we have Trisect. It's going to fire a laser, and if you have full Trinity, you deal a third of the target's HP. Gains 1 Trinity and adds a jam. And it also does 33 damage for whatever that's worth. But we're mostly here for the 1/3 damage. So, in the event you're running a dedicated Trinity build, you can use Trisect as a form of late game scaling, because it's always going to do 33% of the target's HP, but keep in mind that that's current HP. So you can't kill kill Seraph just by tri-casting this on her 3 times. It's referring to current HP. So this card's going to get worse over the course of the fight. The idea is that in a dedicated Trinity build, you're going to use this twice, maybe 3 times on a boss fight as quickly as possible, and then stop spending Trinity on this and using something like Trirag to finish the boss off. This is the kind of card I would not take unless I'm already running a Trinity package that's ready to go and wants this for some late game power. If you're not running a deck that already has some Trinity going on, I wouldn't worry about Trisect. It's kind of like all the other Trinity stuff where I wouldn't worry about it unless I already have ways to get the Trinity going. But if you do have ways to get the Trinity going, this is a very, very powerful effect in the early stages of a boss fight, just because of what it's doing. It doesn't do flat damage, it's taking percentages of HP, and bosses tend to have a lot of HP, so that's going to be a lot of damage. Next up, we got Unleash. You're going to spend X mana and Fire Shot for each mana spent, and it adds a jam to your deck. So, the rate here is always going to be 70 damage per mana, which is about average. This is the kind of card that I think you would want to take if A, you care about the jam, then you can take this, or B, you have such an absurd rate of mana regen that you really need something to dump your mana into, then Unleash is a pretty good candidate. But if neither of those are true, I wouldn't bother with Unleash because there's just much more efficient way to spend your mana than this. Casting a few smaller spells is going to do way more damage than casting one big Unleash, because sure, 70 damage per mana is a okay rate, but besides the jam, it doesn't do anything else. You either need to make use of the jam, or you need to have such an absurd rate of mana regen that you can't keep up with your mana regen, so you're using this to dump mana into. Other than that, I wouldn't bother with it. Finally, we have Viryu spell. Oh boy, this one. Okay, so the idea here is that either you pick this up really early in the run and then you spend the whole run building your deck around this, or you get Midnight later in the run and then you see a Viryu spell, so you pick up the Viryu spell and you try to consume your whole deck on boss fights, so you can just spam out the Viryu spell. Either way, this card's kind of bad if you can't get the anchor off of it. Taking this is a little bit of a gamble, because if you upgrade it once, then you upgrade another time, and neither time you're getting anchor off of it, you're not going to be very happy with it. But if you can get this in a situation where it's got the anchor off of it and you've managed to either cut the rest of your deck or everything else in your deck consumes, or you got the Midnight going on, then this can shred bosses really fast, especially if you can get a few more upgrades on here. It can really provide you some late game scaling that you might be looking for. But as long as it has the anchor on it, it's not very good. You need to find a way to get rid of that anchor to get use out of this. So that's all of the Doublelift spells. Ultimately, the big themes going on here are deck and time manipulation, really. There's also a few outliers here, like Trisect and, well, Sustain makes sense. But you got stuff that cares about the number of cards in your deck. You got stuff that adds jams to your deck. Stuff that does stuff with the card in the other slot, makes you shuffle faster, consumes your deck, and time slows stuff for some reason, and Unleash adds jam, I guess. Sustain, yeah, Sustain makes sense here because it cares about the card in the other slots. Trisect also adds a jam, so I guess that makes sense too. And Viryu spell duplicates itself. So overall, this is a really coherent focus. The cards all make a good amount of sense together, and the only real built-in standalone strategy here is going to be the jam stuff. Most of the other stuff here is supporting type stuff that you want to take when it makes sense, and some cards are just absolutely broken and ridiculous, like Switch Bait or Echo, which can copy your Switch Bait, by the way. And of course, Viryu spell's a standalone strategy. So next time, we'll be going through the Glimmer cards, and I'm really excited about talking about the Glimmer cards, because there's a lot of real bangers in here. So that's gonna cover it for this video. I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye bye.